Per the 1954 Geneva Accords, elections were supposed to be held in 1956 to decide who would lead a unified Vietnam. But the United States prevented this from happening, fearing that the communist Ho Chi Minh would end up winning such an election. Subsequently, the People's Army of North Vietnam began preparations for a war of reunification with South Vietnam. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we go deeper into specific battles fought as part of the Vietnam War, the outcomes, and behind-the-scenes strategy to bring the war to a close. As part of the Geneva Accords of 1954, the citizens of North Vietnam and South Vietnam were given about a year to move back to the north or south, depending upon their preference. But members of the North Vietnam political party Viet Minh stayed in the south, and their ranks were built as more North Vietnamese started infiltrating into the south. The leader in the south, Vo Dinh Diem, called these infiltrators Vietnam Communists or Viet Cong. The overall strategy was to engage in guerrilla warfare with the South Vietnam Army, defeat the South, and reunify Vietnam under the communist leader Ho Chi Minh. And to accomplish this, the North Vietnamese Army began preparing roads and supply lines in 1959 to allow the movement of troops and equipment into South Vietnam. This elaborate network of roads and trails ran from North Vietnam to the south through the kingdoms of Laos and Cambodia and came to be known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And this trail would end up becoming the most important military asset of the North Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. Now, up till the tenure of President John F. Kennedy, the United States had been providing military and economic aid to South Vietnam. But with Kennedy's assassination, the Viet Cong tried to take advantage of the situation and increase their attacks in South Vietnam. One such incident occurred on the night of August 4, 1964, when two US Navy destroyers, Maddox and Turner Joy, reported that they were being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. Within hours, President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered the first US airstrikes against North Vietnam. Subsequently, on August 7, 1964, Congress passed the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which gave President LBJ authority to take all necessary measures to prevent further aggression. Essentially, with the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, Congress authorized the direct involvement of the United States in the Vietnam conflict. One thing of note here is that many still believe that the reported attack by the North Vietnamese in the Gulf of Tonkin was just a false alarm. And some believe that this was done to get Congress to authorize the direct involvement of the United States in the Vietnam conflict. And with the approval from Congress received, the US military went full force, and the military aircraft attacked targets throughout North Vietnam from March 1965 to October 1968. And the aim of this bombardment, codenamed Operation Rolling Thunder, was to put military pressure on North Vietnam and reduce their capacity to wage war against the South. Essentially, LBJ was hoping to achieve success in air without having to send any ground troops to Vietnam. Initially, the airstrikes were restricted to the southern portion of North Vietnam. But very soon, the target area moved steadily northward to increase the pressure on the communist government. And by mid-1966, American planes were attacking military and industrial targets throughout North Vietnam. The only areas considered off-limits were the cities of Hanoi and Haiphong, and a 10-mile buffer zone along the border of China. LBJ wanted to make sure that he did not engage in any direct confrontation with the Soviet Union or China. So was Operation Rolling Thunder a success? On the contrary, it was an abject failure. And there were several factors that contributed to its failure. The first and most visible was that North Vietnam was getting assistance from China and the Soviet Union, and as a result, it had built a fairly sophisticated air defense system. The North Vietnamese were able to use surface-to-air missiles and radar-controlled anti-aircraft artillery to shoot down hundreds of American planes over the course of the bombing campaign. And this is evident from the fact that a majority of the American prisoners of war in North Vietnam were pilots and aircraft weapon systems operators. The other factor was a combination of geography and technology. Geography, because the weather was not conducive for air operations 8 months of the year, mainly because of the cyclical monsoon patterns. So rain and fog tended to conceal targets, but the US Air Force refrained from utilizing their all-weather military aircraft. So the operations had to be carried during bright daylight, which tended to give the Vietnamese at least 30 to 45 minutes of warning of the Rolling Thunder missions. Overall, about 864,000 tons of bombs were dropped on North Vietnam during Operation Rolling Thunder. In comparison, 653,000 tons were dropped in the Korean War and 503,000 tons in the Pacific region during World War II. Now, right around this time, since Ho Chi Minh was getting older, the General Secretary, Le Duan, was increasingly becoming the face of North Vietnam leadership. Now, while the Rolling Thunder campaign was still going on, between 1965 and 1966, there was also political instability in South Vietnam, and Lyndon Johnson wanted to make sure that this did not lead to the US losing South Vietnam. The solution? A massive troop surge. By November 1965, 175,000 US troops had been stationed in South Vietnam, and within a year, an additional 100,000 troops were sent to South Vietnam. And with this troop surge, the North Vietnamese realized that they could not engage with the US military in open combat, which meant they had to switch tactics. That is, guerrilla warfare. And since most of the terrain was thick jungle, it was very conducive to guerrilla warfare. And the most handy asset in the guerrilla warfare were the underground tunnels, part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And despite the Ho Chi Minh Trail being one of the targets of the Operation Rolling Thunder bombing, the Vietnamese had been able to rebuild most of the tunnels and replace them with stronger bomb-proof tunnels and shelters. And they usually achieved this by sending their repair crew during the night to rebuild the network of roads and bridges that had been impacted by the bombing during the day. So how did the guerrilla campaign go? Well, for North Vietnamese, it was a success. And for the American troops, a complete nightmare. The Viet Cong would hide in spider holes under the ground and emerge to execute an ambush. And this would be done just before dark, so they could withdraw under the cover of the night before the enemy had any chance to recover. And the most effective strategy was the layout of a network of booby traps for the American soldiers. Traps which had the punji stick, which was a sharp wooden stick which could disable the enemy, bamboo whips, toe popper mines, and hollowed out trees filled with explosives. Overall, about 20% of American casualties in the Vietnam War were from these booby traps or mines. At this point, the United States realized that the terrain was to blame for these reversals in the war. There was also another factor. While the US Army and South Vietnamese government controlled the large cities in South Vietnam, most of the countryside was under Viet Cong influence and occupation. So the only way to address this was to get rid of the countryside, meaning clear the forests and the vegetation. And this was supposed to achieve a two-pronged outcome. One, with the forests and vegetation gone, the population would shift to the bigger cities which were in control of the US Army and the South Vietnamese government. And second, with the vegetation and the forest cover gone, there would be no more ambushes or booby traps. And how was this achieved? By committing a massive ecocide by use of napalm and Agent Orange over the jungles and the terrain.
Napalm is a mixture of plastic polystyrene, hydrocarbon benzene, and gasoline. And the mixture creates a jelly-like substance which, when ignited, sticks practically to anything and burns up in 10 minutes. Which means it also burns up the human body when it comes in contact, leading to immediate death. Water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, whereas napalm generates temperatures between 1500 degrees Fahrenheit to 2200 degrees Fahrenheit. Napalm was first used in flamethrowers for US ground troops to burn down sections of forest and bushes in hopes of eliminating any enemy guerrillas. Later on, the B-52 bombers began dropping napalm bombs, and each bomb was capable of destroying areas up to 2,500 square yards. But besides the forest cover, it led to the deaths of several Viet Cong and civilian populations in South Vietnam. Agent Orange is a toxic chemical herbicide which is 50 times more toxic and concentrated than normal agricultural herbicide. And the aim was to destroy all agricultural production so that the people would have to move to the cities that were controlled by the US troops. Throughout the operation, about 20 million gallons of herbicides were sprayed over forests and fields, and these led to not just the destruction of the food crops, but also about 4.8 million human deaths and 400,000 children born with birth defects. But why would such a toxic herbicide be produced in the first place? Well, during the war, Dow Chemicals, Monsanto, and other companies were compelled by the US government to produce Agent Orange under the US Defense Production Act of 1950. With the American casualties rising in the war, the American public started protesting the draft and the US engagement in the war. President Lyndon B. Johnson assured the public that the US was coming close to the end of the war. Meanwhile, the North, convinced that the severe napalm and Agent Orange offensives had alienated the South Vietnamese population against the United States, started planning a major offensive in South Vietnam. This ended up being called the Tet Offensive of 1968, which was a coordinated series of North Vietnamese attacks on more than 100 cities and outposts in South Vietnam. Though the US and South Vietnamese forces managed to hold off the attacks, news coverage of this massive offensive shocked the American public, and LBJ took a huge credibility hit. In particular, there was a bold attack on the US Embassy in Saigon, where a Viet Cong platoon got inside the complex's courtyard before the US forces were able to repel the attack. The Tet Offensive in the end was a major defeat for the North Vietnamese. But there was one positive side for them. It sent a strong message to the United States that the war was far from over. And having taken a huge credibility hit, LBJ decided against seeking re-election.
And subsequently, close to the presidential elections, LBJ was able to get the three sides, the United States, South Vietnam, and North Vietnam, to agree to come to the negotiating table. But surprise, surprise, the South Vietnamese withdrew unexpectedly from the peace talks. Why? A clear case of treason under the Logan Act by the Republican presidential candidate Richard Nixon. The Nixon campaign contacted the Vietnamese government secretly and promised that they would offer them a better deal than LBJ or the Democratic candidate Hubert Humphrey. LBJ found out about this because he had had the CIA set illegal wiretaps in the US Embassy. And since he could not reveal his source of information, he allowed Nixon to go scot-free. The 1968 presidential elections brought Richard Nixon into the White House. And he came in knowing that the US public wanted out of Vietnam. And he did too. But he did not want to lose South Vietnam in the process. So the solution? Vietnamization, which is building up South enough so it could withstand any invasion from the North without the US troops being around. And the first step in achieving Vietnamization was through the Phoenix program. The Phoenix program was an operation by the US military and the CIA to identify Viet Cong operatives in South Vietnam and target them for arrest, defection, or assassination. Though it had been started during LBJ's time in office around 1968, it was intensified under Richard Nixon. The problem with the Phoenix program was that it operated under the assumption guilty until proven innocent, which meant thousands of South Vietnamese were rounded up, interrogated, tortured, and ultimately killed. By default, everybody was assumed to be a Viet Cong supporter or informer. Between 20,000 and 40,000 South Vietnamese were killed during the time of the Phoenix program. And yes, you heard the numbers right. Between 20,000 and 40,000 South Vietnamese killed during this time. Now we need to remember that along with Richard Nixon came his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger. And it was Henry Kissinger who masterminded the second part of the Vietnamization strategy. And that was to destroy the Viet Cong supply lines, which meant a direct incursion into Laos and Cambodia. And because the American public would not approve, the invasion was kept a secret. About 30,000 American and 50,000 South Vietnamese military personnel marched into Cambodia and broke through, severely impacting the Viet Cong supply lines. And this was followed by a brutal bombing campaign over Cambodia, which continued long after this invasion ended. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed, and Cambodia itself was flattened from these bombings. This campaign ultimately saw the rise of Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, which would later become powerful enough to commit a horrifying genocide in Cambodia. In 1971, a military force of 15,000 was sent into Laos to achieve the same objective. But they were beaten back. And the American response? Indiscriminately bombed them as well. The American public found out about this, and there were massive protests in San Francisco and DC, led mostly by students. The Nixon administration cracked down on these students, and 4 students were killed in the crackdown. And with so much opposition to the war, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution was repealed in June of 1971. And this meant the number of US soldiers in Vietnam went down from 500,000 to 140,000 by the end of 1971. Now, Ho Chi Minh had passed away in September of 1969, and it was Le Duan who was now in charge in North Vietnam. So in 1972, with the US presidential elections around the corner, Henry Kissinger
brokered a quick ceasefire deal between the North and the South. According to the agreement, there would be a ceasefire, full US withdrawal, North Vietnam would free all the POWs, and a tripartite commission would be established to decide on the nature of the government in South Vietnam. The American public was happy, and Richard Nixon romped home to a second term in the White House. The ceasefire deal was formally signed and inked on January 27, 1973, in Paris, and came to be known as the Paris Peace Accords. Within 2 months, 20,000 remaining US troops left South Vietnam, and 600 prisoners of war were released by North Vietnam. Here on, what happened in South Vietnam is very close to what happened after US withdrawal in Afghanistan. South Vietnam was left with state-of-the-art military equipment, but without US support, they were incapable of maintaining it. And to make matters worse, Richard Nixon decided to snoop on the Democratic National Headquarters and ended up resigning as a fallout of the Watergate scandal in August of 1974. And during all the Watergate turmoil, the financial aid to South also dried up. Meanwhile, in North Vietnam, the military and financial aid from China and Soviet Union was still on, and what was best was that the Ho Chi Minh Trail was no longer getting bombed. So on December 12, 1974, North Vietnam forgot all about the Paris Accords and launched a massive offensive on South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese crossed over into South Vietnam, marching towards the provincial capital of Phuoc Long. The South Vietnamese military command promptly abandoned the city. More military outposts fell, and the northern artillery and rockets bombarded the region heavily, causing huge casualties on civilians and soldiers. The collapse of South Vietnam was rapid, and within just a few weeks, the North Vietnamese had surrounded the capital Saigon. South Vietnamese President Thieu resigned and fled the country. On April 30, 1975, the North Vietnamese forces entered the presidential palace. The Viet Cong flag was hoisted, and South Vietnam ceased to exist. There were several scenes of South Vietnamese fleeing to get aboard US naval vessels, but many were left behind. In the end, Vietnam was unified under the North Vietnamese rule, something that would have happened had the elections been held in 1956. Millions of Vietnamese and tens of thousands of American soldiers were killed in this decades-long war. Both North and South Vietnam were left in ruins, and the millions of tons of herbicides poured over South Vietnam have led to cancers, birth defects, and long-lasting neurological disorders. And speaking of the intense bombing campaign, on an average, a bomb fell on Laos every 8 minutes for 9 years, making it the most bombed country in history. But the biggest irony in the entire conflict was that Henry Kissinger received the 1973 Nobel Peace Prize for brokering the ceasefire deal between the two Vietnams. He shared the prize with Le Duc Tho, the chief negotiator on the North Vietnamese side in the peace talks. But Le Duc Tho became the first person in the history of Nobel Prizes to decline the award, saying that when the Paris Agreement on Vietnam is respected, guns are silenced, and peace is really restored in South Vietnam, I will consider the acceptance of this prize. Ironically, he was planning the full-fledged invasion of South Vietnam when he made that statement. And Henry Kissinger, fearing that he would be met by angry protests, skipped receiving the award in person. The Nobel Committee itself saw 2 of its members resign when the award was announced. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. As part of the 1954 Geneva Accords on Vietnam,
which three countries were chosen to supervise the implementation of the Accords and the election for reunification. An international commission was established composed of Canadian, Polish, and Indian members under an Indian chairman to supervise the execution of the agreement. So the answer is D, Canada, Poland, and India. Question for the current episode. Which official in the Lyndon B. Johnson administration made the following infamous statement in reference to the Vietnam conflict? Quote, "Look, if you think any American official is going to tell you the truth, then you are stupid. Did you hear that? Stupid." End quote. Was it A, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, B, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, C, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs Arthur Sylvester, or D, US military commander in Vietnam William Westmoreland? Once again, which official in the Lyndon B. Johnson administration made the following statement in reference to the Vietnam conflict? Quote, "Look, if you think any American official is going to tell you the truth, then you are stupid. Did you hear that? Stupid." End quote. Was it A, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, B, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, C, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs Arthur Sylvester, or D, US military commander in Vietnam William Westmoreland? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. In the next episode, since we are in the throes of the US presidential election, we'll take a look into the past presidential elections, close contests, the pattern of voting, and any unique milestones. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.